Welcome to another episode of the Smarter Practice Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Matheney with Smart Training. Again, with 15 years of learning development experience and over 14 in the dental industry. Again, excited to have Stef here with me. And Stef, you want to talk about yourself?
Absolutely. So glad to be back here, Josh. I'm Stef Simich, the owner of Brave Work, which is a coaching firm that supports dental practices and DSOs across the nation, helping elevate their current operations through enhanced learning. Excited to be here.
I'm really excited about this topic because we're going to be able to talk about change experience. And Stef, I know this is a passion project for you. That is something you live and breathe every day. So tell me a little bit about what your experience has been and how you've become such a proponent of improving our change experience.
Absolutely. So through my experience with change, there's been a lot of different buzzwords that have gone around. So you have change leadership, which change leadership was all about positivity from the top down. And then everyone was talking about change management. How do we help team members navigate and manage change? And with both of those things, they were great philosophies in the beginning. But at the end of the day, you can't have somebody telling you to be more positive. And with change management, you can't really control everything that team members are going through. And that's when I stepped back and I thought, well, what is change? Like, how do people change? And they change because there's a really good thing or a really bad thing that ends up happening. And that creates this experience for them to where they change. And so what if we could be more intentional about those experiences? So as a leadership team or organization, or even just in a single dental practice, how can you, at the end of the day, create experiences that ignite change in your team?
That's goes right along with what I've always heard, which is that you change when there's a birth or a death or a marriage, when there's big life events. But this kind of seems like a huge topic. So where do we actually get started with this whole process of evaluating how we can improve how we're going to go about change?
So there's a lot of ways to look at it. And I know we can talk about a couple things, but at the end of the day, do you have an intentional plan? So with a group that I work with that has a turnover sometimes in their operation manager role, we created a hybrid operation manager orientation process. And so instead of the old onboarding process of a new manager coming in and they're drinking from the fire hose and they're having to learn everything quickly while their team is pulling at them, what we've created is a timeline where on the first week, they're going to get an e-learning training about payroll and HR. But on the fourth week, they're going to get marketing and purchasing training. Now, after they get these e-learning trainings, when they need them, when they're approaching those issues in the practice, they also have a workshop that happens with one of the department heads. So in this organization, they do have a support center that is able to do some Teams online training with them after they've done their their e-learning training. And so that's one of the ways that they're getting the training assigned to them when they need it, when they're going to be asked for it. But then also they're getting to meet the department heads and really creating a collaborative environment. So then after 45 days, they know everybody.
Sounds like you've approached that really intentionally. But if you don't have a big, huge support team, what can you do to really facilitate all these different steps that you've talked about? Or is there a different approach for a small practice versus a large group?
Absolutely. So big or small, at the end of the day, we all experience change, right? So whether you're a practice team of 5 close-knit team members or you're a DSO that has 100 practices, at the end of the day, are you being intentional on what the experiences that people have to ignite that change? And so in a solo dental practice, when I work with them, we talk about documenting an onboarding plan. Do we expect that this team member joins and they're already assisting and doing all of that the first day? Or do we get them acclimated to the practice and where the instruments are and all the operatories? And so again, whether you're this big group that has all of the support or you're a small group, do you have a documented plan for people when they come in that has some flexibility, because we all are our own humans, but at the end of the day, are you being intentional about the team in your practice?
That intentionality, that really reminds me of some experiences. Some have been a little bit negative in my church service experience, where I've been given a new responsibility and given no instruction and just said, here's what your title is, figure it out. And that created a lot of negative feelings around, am I being successful? Am I not being successful? Maybe I felt like I was doing the right thing and it turns out I was completely off and left field. So I know how bad it can go. And I've had a couple of good experiences where there has been a little bit more of a mentoring through that. But what about yourself?
I mean, same thing. So, whether it was getting promoted from a single practice where I was there for 8 months, had insane profit margins, suddenly I became a regional manager, and I was trying to figure out how do I make that same impact with 5 practices that I was making with one practice team. And although at the time I had a great leader and she always told me to give her a call, I didn't want her to know how in over my head I was. It was that old adage, fake it till you make it, which I do not believe in anymore. It's yes, and yes, I'll take this opportunity. And what does the onboarding look like?
Yeah.
So, but I mean, absolutely. I've had those times where because I did one job well, they're like, oh, she's going to do this job well. And eventually I did, but it was really hard navigating that change.
Yeah. And that reminds me of another thing that I've seen often, which is you take like a salesperson, your best salesperson, and you promote them to manager because if they're really good, then they can make everybody else really good. But oftentimes, either they're not given the right tools to be successful in that job, or the skill set that they currently have that makes them a great salesperson makes them a terrible sales manager. And so how do you identify some of those misfits, or at least some reskilling that might be necessary when you're making a bigger change?
Absolutely. So often we'll see an individual contributor, so that's what we would call a sales team member, an individual contributor who moves to a leadership role, and there is such a disconnect in that because the skills to be an individual contributor are very different than a leader. And so that, again, is where change experience is so important. And whether it's a single practice or a big group, when you're moving somebody to do a role that they have not done before, are you assessing their current skills? So what current skills do they have today? And what skills do they need to do that job well? And what is that bridge to get there? Yeah. So different than a skill gap analysis that we talked about recently, where you're kind of looking at the whole company as a whole and you're thinking of how to improve your training that you have. This is very granular to this individual and what skills do they need to develop and by when to be successful in that role.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're really talking about the foundation of this change experience. All starts with being able to talk about the experience, being able to communicate effectively from both sides, the person experiencing the change and maybe the person implementing the change that's given you the new responsibility.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, if we're not talking about the experiences, nothing's going to change and we don't even know what needs to change.
So a little moment of vulnerability here. As a man, hearing about talking about my feelings just has my stress levels going through the roof. But how do we approach talking about maybe some of our more emotionally connected feelings and doing that in a safe place where we're able to really connect instead of just talk at each other?
Absolutely. So I can't fix that men don't like to talk. I've been doing the Lord's work trying to do that. But no, at the end of the day, where it's sometimes more challenging in a dynamic that might be more personal, in a professional setting, it really comes down to emotional intelligence. And remember that as a leader, we're creating space for people to share their experiences with us. And so how an individual could do this, like if you're not a leader, absolutely go to your boss and say, hey, I've been navigating some change in this new role and I'm struggling. Can we talk about it? And then that's just a really good way. I know it seems scary, but it will make the difference. But as a leader, this is where emotional intelligence and one-on-ones are going to come in play. Because just like you said, it's vulnerable to share how you're feeling. If there are more than 2 people in a room, they're going to feel that way. So your team doesn't necessarily want to share how they're feeling at that staff meeting once a month. So make sure you're doing a one-on-one with them.
I can't add enough how important that one-on-one environment could be, because if there's more than one person in the room that I'm talking to, it's a totally different approach that I'm going to have. I'm not going to voice my real concerns. I'm going to kind of gloss over it. And I've seen that on the other side where I've been a leader as well, and I've had that opportunity to invite somebody. I could tell that something was off, and I just invite them, hey, let's just chat for a few minutes. And I've been really kind of surprised at sometimes where I saw something was off, but I end up pulling them into a one-on-one and tears start flowing. I'm like, whoa, I wasn't prepared for that, but I'm so glad that I picked up on something so that we could have that conversation. afterwards, it was like a whole new person at the office. They were engaged and energetic. They just had some things that they needed to expose, and we worked through them. And it really wasn't even that big of a deal.
But to them, it felt so daunting. If they would have had to present that emotion or whatever they are struggling with in front of their peers, they're worried about the perception, and then they're not going to get stuck. So by having that vulnerable moment with you being able to talk about the experience, you now know what needs to change. And that's where I was saying, it's like we have to talk about these experiences so we can even identify the change needed.
So I'm a leader invested in this change philosophy. I've set up a one-on-one. What are my steps to make sure that I'm going into that prepared to have a positive experience and not just checking off a box?
Absolutely. So every leader, I don't care how long you've been in leadership, these are the 3 emotional intelligence tips I always give them. So the first one is to be self-aware. So do you know the experience you're causing around you? Do you know how the way you ask questions is impacting your team? And then also, by being self-aware, model communicating. So if you're struggling with an experience or if there's something going on, you share that. And then that shows your team how to even start this conversation. Second is to be curious. So when they tell you their feeling, you don't deny it. You don't say that they don't feel that way or that wasn't their experience, but you use my 3 favorite words in the English language. Tell me more. The more you ask people to tell you more, the more that comes out of them. And again, you might have the floodgates, so have some Kleenex ready, but they're ready to share.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, going back to that one-on-one. So if something gets brought up in a group setting, follow up with that individual that brought that to them in a one-on-one, and so be consistent with that. So the first thing, if you do have things brought up in a group environment, you always want to handle it diplomatically as a leader, but then you want to follow up with individuals one-on-one and understand their stories better. And then once they've shared their experience with you, make sure you're staying consistent on those follow-ups with them and you're checking in. And then that way you're not surprised or caught off guard.
Great tips. I love it. And I didn't expect this to turn into such a therapy session. But I'm actually really excited to be able to have reflected a little bit on my own experiences and to be able to hear, again, some of your tips for this. And so I'm really excited to be able to take this into the real world. And I hope you are as well. And with that, I'd like to invite you not to just work smarter, but to live smarter.